Welcome to week one of the Ultimate Tender Coach training program. My name is Andrew Morrison and I'm the founder of AM Bid, and with my fellow directors David Gray and Philip Thompson, we've enjoyed putting together this training program, and we're also going to support you with a weekly coaching call for 1 hour that you'll be able to join with fellow members of Ultimate Tender Coach, and we will also have a LinkedIn support group that you're welcome to join as well. My own background is I worked for 12 years in the public sector, and while there I got involved in putting things out to tender, in marking bids, in interviewing suppliers, in awarding contracts. I've now been bidding to the public sector and the private sector as well for the last 16 years. So I've got experience of hundreds of tender processes. In week one, I'm going to be talking about identifying public sector opportunities you can win. This first module is going to talk about the road ahead and where it leads. We'll then go on to talk in our next module about where to look for public opportunities, what the procurement process will look like, and how to qualify or disqualify opportunities. Along the way, there'll be some action sheets. These are to stimulate practical learning, to put into practice what you have learned in this training program in a real life situation that you can use, and that will help you as you get ready for public sector bidding. Or perhaps you're already involved in public sector bidding and just want to improve your success rates. In this first module, I'm going to give you an introduction to public sector bidding in the UK, a bit of an overview. I will also draw out the key differences between public tenders and private sector proposals, because they are quite different processes. We'll discuss the benefits of building a public sector client base. We'll try to clear up some common misconceptions that exist around bidding to the public sector. And we'll share some testimonials from clients who've established and grown a public sector client base. So to begin with, let's have an introduction to public sector bidding within the UK. Now, the opportunity, the market here is substantial. In fact, it's massive. The public sector tenders out through public procurement processes around £290 billion of spend per annum. What are we talking about when we talk about the public sector? Well, it obviously comprises the UK government, central government, but the devolved administrations as well. For example, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland arrangements. Also local government. So whether it's local authorities or councils as they're called, and also sometimes bodies that they will form, such as limited liability partnerships, perhaps to run things like sporting establishments. The National Health Service, of course, is a very significant and important part of the UK public sector, as are universities and colleges, and also housing associations. Now, housing associations are not public sector bodies as such, but they often procure in similar ways and often use some of the same, tender contract notice arrangements. The public sector is legally required to have an open and transparent procurement process. This is covered by primary legislation, It's covered to some extent by regulation, and there's also a lot of guidance as well. Spend is categorised as goods and services or works, and we'll talk more about that later. Contracts above threshold values have to go to full public tender. So these values, for example, for 2021 are shown on this slide here. That's £122,976, anything over that for central government. Other contracting authorities, it's expenditure that's over 189,330. That's for goods and services. It's a much higher number for works contracts, and these will typically be contracts involving building, involving infrastructure, regeneration type works, major works contracts. And the threshold level there is £4,733,252. In Scotland, since the procurement legislation changed in 2014, it actually came into force in 2016, the values are much lower. So contracts above £50,000 for goods and services in Scotland and those above £2 million for works have to go through full tender processes, fully publicly advertised and open to all bidders who could qualify for them. When we talk about contract values, it's important to note that we're talking about the value of the entire contract. So if we were going to say, for example, a contract for £50,000 for a local authority, is it £50,000 a year? Or is it £50,000 across the value of the contract, the length of the contract? So for example, a contract that was £50,000 a year for 4 years, well, that's £200,000, and that would need to go through a full tender process. But if it was £50,000 a year, but only for 2 years, that's £100,000. And apart from it in Scotland, but in other parts of the UK, that would not have to go through a full tender process. And instead, the individual buyer would have the opportunity to request quotes through the delegated arrangements that they would have and in line with any standing orders within their organisation. So it's important to note that when we're talking about the minimum values that have to be advertised, these are the values of the contract throughout its period. That should also aggregate any extension options that are put in there as well. So what are the key differences between public tenders and private sector proposals? So the key characteristics of public sector tenders, first of all, to reiterate what I've said already, is that they have to be publicly advertised. They have to be open to all bidders who meet the stated minimum criteria. So they can put criteria in there such as financial and economic standing. These have to be reasonable to do with the value of the contract, and there is guidance on this. But for example, it could be minimum turnover levels, because they don't want an organisation given a contract that is too big really for it to cope with. There could be rules around how long the organisation has had to be in business. There could be rules around, for example, financial ratios such as acid test ratios, or it could be that organisations have to meet a minimum credit rating score, such as an Experian score, for example, a minimum of 50 out of 100. Now, with some of these minimum financial and economic standing criteria, buyers sometimes will be prepared to accept other forms of assurance that the organisation is financially sound. So they may look for management accounts, they may look for information around how much money the organisation has got within the bank or what lines of credit they have, etc. A buying organisation will also typically put some kind of professional or trade memberships as minimum criteria. So for example, if we're talking about a contract for legal services, then they would have to be qualified solicitors within the organisation. Similar with accountancy. Similar, of course, even with trades as well. If we're talking about trades, we were talking about maybe electricians, we're talking about gas engineers, etc. Then these would have to be properly qualified and properly registered with the relevant trade bodies. When it gets to the evaluation, the scoring of the bids, that's past the minimum qualification levels. So an organisation maybe passes the first cut, it passes through the qualification levels, etc. But now we're looking at a tender process, and we'll go into more detail, of course, within this programme about the various tender processes. But if I say right at the start here, the tenders are typically evaluated on a price quality split. So there'll be some kind of pricing matrix that has to be completed for the goods, services or works, and there'll also be some technical statements that have to be written. These are like mini essays, and they're perhaps going to deal with how the contract is going to be delivered, what the customer care arrangements are going to be, what the health and safety arrangements are going to be, what the approach to quality management is, etc. So these questions that then mini essays have to be written for. Sometimes it's just a few hundred words, sometimes it's a bit more than that, but these are scored a bit like they would have been in a school or university exam. These are scored, the mark for the quality is added to the mark for the price, and that is the overall then result. So this is typically called a meet basis, a most economically advantageous tender, and it is a mix of price and technical or quality, and the percentages can be set by the buyer, and they should have some regard to obviously the situation, what it is that they're actually procuring. So if they're procuring a commodity, for example, then perhaps service is less important. It's never of no importance, but it may be of lesser importance than, for example, if it was procuring personal care for the perhaps elderly, disabled, etc. Very much a person-centred approach. Well, usually in a bid like that, price is less important. Often the prices are to do with budgets, available budgets, but the quality of the care that's being provided, well, that is of paramount importance. So you'd expect to see that as a very high quality ratio on a bid like that, whereas a commodity that you're perhaps purchasing fuel, you would expect to see a very high price ratio there. The public sector is also required to provide debrief feedback to all bidders. So typically the feedback that you get provided with might be your scoring, your ranking, where your bid ranked. Was it first? Was it third? Was it sixth? You may get given the total of all bidders. You might get your price score, your quality score. You should usually expect to get some written debrief feedback as well about your technical responses, where they scored well, where they could have been improved. And you'll also get some information if you have been unsuccessful in what differentiated the winning bidder, basically why they won. The private sector, this is quite a different way of operating. So generally, they are not going out on portals advertising the need that they have, although in some sectors they do this. So it's important to just be aware of what's going on within your own sector. but typically the private sector will operate an invitation-only process. So typically they'll invite proposals from a limited number of potential providers. So how do they actually come up with this initial list? Well, if somebody's already delivering the services for them, you've got an existing supplier. So unless the relationship is bad, perhaps due to bad service or quality, then the existing supplier would usually be expected to be invited to re-tender here or rebid. The buyers will also make a bit of an internet search to see who's out there. There may be recommendations and referrals that they've had. So procurement, who are the buyers, will usually be buying on behalf of a particular department within a client organisation. So usually that department will have some kind of idea about the sort of business that they want to deal with, and they may have had recommendations or referrals from people that they know who are able to say that they have had a good service from supplier X. The buyer will usually be interested as well in the known market leader or leaders, just to see what they would be prepared to offer, and also as well some challenger brands, because there's always new organisations coming along, there's new ways of thinking, there's new ways of delivering service, so they'll go out to see what's out there. So I would say having your public presence, having the volume turned up publicly where possible, so as you're known. I mean, how do you separate yourself out? So it's good to be known. It's good to be known for thought leadership. It's good to have regular social media activity, including maybe following your target clients, liking what they do, perhaps commenting on it sometimes as well. All of this matters. In fact, in the private sector, it can be said sometimes that your business needs to have been known about maybe 5 or 12 different times or ways. So people need to have come across you in different places. Maybe they've met you in person at an event. Maybe they've read about you within a newspaper or periodical. Maybe they've seen you on social media. Maybe they've watched one of your videos. Maybe they've heard that your business has won a business award. So there's this triangulation where they're learning about you in different ways from different places, and it comes together, and then they decide, yes, we want to invite you to submit a proposal to us. Having satisfied themselves on technical competence, so a bit similar to the public sector, they do want to make sure that you can deliver this, that you've got a track record, that you've probably got referenceable clients who are prepared to say you've delivered something similar for them to a high standard, of course. Then the private sector will often make the final selection on price. Not always, and sometimes they are prepared to pay more for something higher quality, providing there's a clear benefit to them, there's a clear return on investment for them. A bit like ourselves, sometimes we'll make a decision perhaps to get a better car or go a better holiday than perhaps we necessarily would normally have or would normally want, because the part of a buying decision, particularly in the private sector, there's a bit of an emotional decision going on as well. So if you can really make your customer value proposition clear, then you could stand to do very well here. But once they've made their decision, and particularly if it's not been a favourable decision for you, someone else has won this pitch process, it can be quite difficult in the private sector to get feedback and detailed, granular feedback about your bid. We've said that in the public sector, they have to, by legislation, actually provide some feedback, but they don't have to in the private sector. Particularly if you're an SME business though, you want to stress that to them when you're asking for feedback. Just say, as a continuously improving SME business, we would like to get some specific feedback about our bid. Now, the private sector also works a lot on relationships, who people know, etc. So if you know somebody in your organisation that knows somebody in that organisation, so possibly it might be your sales or business development lead, and they know somebody at the client end, then you want to sort of use that as an opportunity for them to go away and get some information, some debrief feedback. It'd be great if you could end up finding out, for example, what had differentiated the winning bidder. Get some information as well about your pricing. If you've been told that your pricing's too high, did they understand the offering that you made? What was included within that? What was perhaps added value, etc. But when you get feedback, make sure you do something with it as well. So we're now going to talk about the benefits of building a public sector client base. And I think this particularly was highlighted during the global pandemic, which started for the UK anyway, mainly in March 2020. And the many private sector firms really slowed up on their procurement, and there was, of course, large parts of the economy were closed down as well, although much of the public sector remained open for business and requiring goods and services. So in uncertain times, having public sector clients can be very important for SME businesses, because the public sector will not go out of business. The local authorities, the governments, etc. They've been around for a very long time, so they will not go out of business quickly or overnight necessarily. So because of that, you will have very good credit ratings if most of your business is perhaps public sector clients, because you're going to have a client who pays quickly, a client who, as mentioned, is not going to go out of business and has got a steady stream of work to give you. Now, the due diligence that's applied to the public sector process, that can often instill incremental confidence from private sector businesses and domestic customers, opening up more opportunities. So to some people, the fact that you're doing work for the government or for the local authority or for the university or for the NHS, then that in itself, for example, if you're doing work in the NHS, then you're able to do work in a safe way. You've been assessed as being able to do work in a way that's going to minimise a disruption to patients, to staff, to visitors, etc. So then if you were looking to do work in another part of the economy or in a private home, etc., you'd be able to actually say, well, do you know what? I've had to take all of that and more into account in the work that I do for the NHS. Public sector contracts may help to insulate the business a bit during quiet times and economic downturns. So having some guarantee of regular work. A lot of the contracts don't fully guarantee completely regular work, because sometimes the contracts are based on when there is going to be a need for these particular things. But generally, they can say at the outset roughly how much is going to be spent via this contract, so it gives you some certainty. Having multi-year public sector contracts will increase the value of the business, and that is important to SME businesses particularly. The public sector has quite a focus on quality management and business continuity, and we'll talk more about this within the training programme. But all the hoops, as it were, that you're having to jump through around quality management, around the environmental, the sustainability aspects of your business, the business continuity, the information security arrangements, etc. Well, a lot of these things are just good business sense, so they will improve resilience for your business. One other thing I'd just like to say as well is once you've got the public sector contract, then there may be spend that's even greater than the amount that they advertise. They'll have a tolerance level that they can maybe put a little bit more spend through there, or they may have other spend that they give you that is below the publicly advertised threshold levels, but because you've already passed through a tender process, it can open up the way to award you further contracts as well. Let's now deal with some common misconceptions, things that have perhaps put organisations, especially SME businesses, off bidding to the public sector. So these common misconceptions, one is that the process is very complex and highly bureaucratic. So what I would say is I would take out some of the words there. The process can seem complex, it can seem bureaucratic, but it does actually form patterns that once you get used to bidding to the public sector, it will often be quite similar, depending which organisation you're bidding to. And in fact, a lot of work has been done around having things like supplier qualification questionnaires that are broadly similar across the public sector. So that's to save you having to continue and keep answering similar questions in different ways. There's a misconception it can be difficult to win public sector contracts. Actually, some public sector contracts attract very few bidders and therefore could be easier to win perhaps than private sector opportunities. It's not difficult to win public sector contracts provided you know how. And you're taking a big step towards winning public sector contracts by going through this training programme. You'll get lots of insights into what could seem quite a complex system. Another misconception is that public sector contracts nearly always go to the incumbent provider, whoever is already placed there delivering the goods and services. And although legally the public sector have to go through a retender process at the end of the contract, many people could think, well, it'll just go to the people that are already in there delivering the goods, services or works. In fact, research shows that the incumbent provider will win perhaps around half of the contracts. That can absolutely vary by sector. It can vary by the type of buying organisation as well. But it's by no means a done deal that the incumbent provider will win the retendered contract, and it's certainly not an automatic win for them. A brilliant bid is difficult to turn down. So if you go in at a good price with a well-written, well-structured bid that has got clear customer value propositions, so what I'm saying here is you're not just talking all about yourself, but you're talking about what you will do for the public sector client and their customers. Remember, the public sector is set up to serve the public. So talking about what you will do for the organisation itself, so if we're talking about a local authority, what you will do for the council as a client, what you will do for its customers, the individual members of the public that are using the service, but not just the service users, but what you will do for the wider community as well. So if you put together a brilliant, well-structured bid, that answers the questions, but in a way that makes that customer value proposition clear, and importantly, your price is competitive, then that brilliant bid can be difficult for the public sector to turn down, especially as they're required to be open and transparent in the scoring, the feedback, etc. And of course, some of this is potentially open to freedom of information requests, but it's also open to legal challenge if an organisation felt that they had actually been unfairly treated or discriminated against through the procurement process. We'll talk more about that in a future week, but suffice to say, don't think it is just a done deal for the incumbent provider to win it. The public sector also does not always choose the lowest price bid. We've seen bids win, and they've perhaps been several £1,000,000, sometimes more expensive than the lowest price bid. In smaller contracts, the differences are of course necessarily smaller, but it's by no means that the lowest price bid always wins. In fact, it often doesn't win because of the meat criteria, the evaluation criteria. It's the most economically advantageous tender, and that tender, a bit like most of the buying decisions that we make as individual consumers, tends to be based on a mixture of price and quality. It's very much the same in the public sector. People, particularly in perhaps some other countries in the world, but even in the UK as well, are sometimes concerned about corruption. There are occasionally within the UK legal cases where people are taken to court. They've been involved in some kind of corrupt activity, a corrupt public sector official and a corrupt, perhaps, private sector supplier getting together to manufacture a tender process in some way that is, of course, illegal. Now, that I would say that corruption within the public sector in the UK, and I can only talk about the experiences I've had across nearly 30 years of working here, I would say are refreshingly rare. That's not the case in some other countries of the world where there really is a lot of corruption within public sector contracts. But I think you can be fairly satisfied that the vast majority of people that work in the public sector in the UK are honest people, people that are there because they want to do the best for the general public. And there are also people that are dedicated to their job, to their professions as well, and they want to act in a fair and transparent manner. So that's the case most of the time. One misconception that certainly was not a misconception when I started in the sector nearly 30 years ago was that public sector clients are very slow payers, and they were. They would often take months to pay their bills. Now, I'm delighted to say that has been completely transformed, particularly over the last 10 years or so, in which case most of the public sector are paying everything within 30 days, and many parts of the public sector are paying within 14, 10, even 5 days. So the public sector now are good, quick payers. Some people feel that public sector opportunities are not clearly advertised, and while that may be the case for some, in most cases I think this is the person who's made that statement. It tends to be their own unfamiliarity with what can be a bit of a complex process. So it is perhaps that they don't necessarily know where to look. Some SME bidders also think that that they're too small to win a public sector contract. It's only going to go to a large company. Well, I'm pleased to say that is not the case at all. Many SME businesses successfully win public sector contracts. In fact, the public sector have got stated aims for perhaps around 25-30% of their contracts to go to small medium enterprise businesses. So please, as a smaller company, do not be put off going for public sector contracts. Obviously go for ones of a size that you are likely to win, ones that you can reference doing something similar with. If you go for massive contracts, then you may be going for things that are just too big. So I would say that your approach should be start local as much as you can and start small, and you will then be able to progress towards larger contracts. So hopefully I've debunked quite a lot of these misconceptions. Some of them have got some basis in fact, but if you could say probably quite a lot of similar things about some of the private sector processes. Generally speaking, in life, it applies to a lot of things. It could apply to job interviews. You could say, well, I'm not going to go for a job interview in case I don't get the job. I'm not going to compete in that race in case I don't win, etc. You've got to be in it to at least stand a chance of winning it. And as we'll talk about in this training program, there's a lot you can do to improve your win prospects. I'd like to share just 3 testimonials now from clients of AMBid who've worked with us and actually seen their success within public sector contracts improve measurably. So the first one is a testimonial from clients called Pursuit Marketing. And interesting to see what Lorraine Gray, a director there, said. Having primarily operated within the private sector, Pursuit recognised our highly trained and motivated staff, combined with our cutting-edge technologies, could be used to drive value within public sector projects. Pursuit now has a full understanding of the complexity of public sector procurement and the opportunities available to us. We look forward to continued success with future bids and would not hesitate to recommend AMBid's service to any organisation seeking to diversify to include public sector contracts. So that's basically taking the success that they were achieving in the private sector and bringing that in to the public sector. A large energy services company, Vattenfall, and Alfie Kenward, at the time Senior Bid Development Manager at Vattenfall, he said our training course from AMBid was excellent. We left with the skills needed to help make winning easier. And then 8,000 miles away, Kevin Ironside, the Managing Director of the Falkland Islands Company, he said it was clear we did not have the required skill sets within our business to professionally present ourselves at the level necessary on such a high profile and valuable piece of business. With the right support of AMBid, I am happy to confirm that we achieved preferred bidder status. So that was on a UK public sector opportunity that was involved there as well. So, in summary, what can we say about the road and where it leads? Well, the market potential is massive. With £290 billion of annual spend via tenders, the UK public sector and its component parts, well, it's a huge and lucrative market. And it's a market that's very much open for business to SME businesses. The procurement processes are governed by legislation, and the public sector generally operates in a fair and transparent way. There are minimum thresholds that everything above these thresholds has to be fully and openly advertised. And the business opportunities that public sector contracts present to your organisation are also considerable. This is a client who's not going out of business, and it's one who generally pays quickly. You could also say that a structured approach supported by expert bidding assistance, such as you're getting via this programme, this can and will produce winning results. So what's up next? Well, next we're going to go on to Module 2, which is where to look for all of these public opportunities, and this one will also feature our first worksheet, a practical exercise for you to complete. So I hope you've enjoyed this first module of the Ultimate Tender Coach training program.